The knife went in. 4 words. No subject. The knife, not the man holding it, is the actor in that sentence. Theodore Dalrymple heard that construction so many times in 20 years, inside a British hospital and a prison, that he began to think of it as a diagnostic symptom. Not of violence, of something deeper. A culture that had learned to remove the human being from the center of the human story. Now read these sentences the same way. The dose was too high. People got addicted. The pills were too powerful. He just couldn't stop. No one did anything. Things happened to people. And a system was built around that grammar, a system worth tens of billions of dollars that had no structural interest in ever questioning it. By the end of this, you'll be able to name the mechanism behind the fentanyl crisis that the treatment industry could not afford to name. And you'll understand why the suspicion you've carried, the one you weren't supposed to say out loud, was not ignorance. It was not grief distorting your judgment. It was the most accurate reading in the room. Dalrymple spent the 1980s and 1990s as a physician inside a hospital and a prison in one of England's most deprived urban areas. What he documented there was not what the public health establishment wanted to hear, which is why it took him a decade to find a serious readership. What he found was this: the long-term poor were not, in the main, prisoners of their material circumstances. They were prisoners of a set of ideas about blame, about effort, about whether the promises you make to people deserve to be kept. Those ideas did not arise in the slums. They descended from universities, from think tanks, from people with advanced degrees who would never, under any circumstances, actually live by them. The passive voice was the tell. In 20 years of clinical practice, Dalrymple almost never heard a patient take direct grammatical ownership of the worst things they had done. The knife went in. The drugs appeared. Things happened. He wasn't noting this to condemn them. He understood, clinically and humanly, why the grammar worked that way. He was noting it because the grammar had become a worldview, and the worldview had consequences. When you can no longer say, "I did this," you cannot begin to say, "I can stop doing this." The two sentences are grammatically connected. Remove agency from one, and you've removed it from the other. He called this finding unwelcome. That's understating it. The standard objection arrives quickly, and it's worth taking seriously. What Dalrymple observed in Birmingham is a specific population in a specific historical moment. You can't simply translate that to America. Different drugs, different demographics, different healthcare system, different culture. Fair enough, let's make that translation carefully. What Dalrymple documented was not a British phenomenon. It was a response to a specific set of ideas about addiction, about agency, about what compassion requires, that had migrated from intellectual culture into institutional practice. Those ideas had no passport restrictions. They traveled. By the time Dalrymple published Life at the Bottom in 2001, American medicine had already begun its own version of the same experiment. Purdue Pharma had been marketing OxyContin for 5 years. The pitch to physicians was scientific. Pain was undertreated in America. Opioids were safe when used properly. And the patients who reported euphoria and craving were exhibiting something the company named pseudo-addiction. They just needed higher doses. The agency was being extracted from the medical narrative in the same direction, toward the same destination, for slightly different reasons. In Britain, Dalrymple watched the welfare state do it as an act of misguided compassion. In America, the pharmaceutical industry did it as an act of revenue optimization. The destination was identical. A patient whose condition was defined entirely by external forces, whose recovery therefore required external management indefinitely. If you wanted to design a system that never ran out of customers, you could not do better than a disease that, by definition, the patient could not cure by choosing to. Here is what Dalrymple wrote in City Journal in 2006, not as a prediction exactly, but as a description of a convergence he could already see in motion. He described 3 forces that had aligned. A pharmaceutical industry with a financial interest in the broadest possible definition of pain and the broadest possible prescription of its remedy. A medical establishment that had adopted the disease model of addiction as settled science, not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because it made the treatment of addiction legible within the existing framework of medicine and billable within the existing framework of insurance, and a therapeutic culture that had progressively redefined the goal of treatment. Not sobriety, not recovery, not the patient standing on his own feet, but engagement, participation in services, retention. He was describing 2006. He was describing conditions that had been building for a decade. By 2010, OxyContin had been reformulated to reduce abuse. The patients who had become dependent didn't stop. They migrated to heroin, which was cheaper and more available than it had been in a generation because supply had followed demand. By 2013, heroin overdose deaths had doubled in 3 years. By 2016, illicitly manufactured fentanyl had entered the supply, 50 times more potent than morphine, cheap to produce, impossible to see or smell or test without equipment no user carries. In 2022, the Centers for Disease Control reported that over 74,000 Americans died from synthetic opioid overdoses, the single-year record. In a year when treatment programs were more funded, more accessible, and more destigmatized than at any point in American history, the treatment kept expanding. The deaths kept rising. Something in that sentence demands explanation, and the comfortable one, they just didn't have enough resources, stops working when you look at the numbers. There's a book most people in this conversation have never read, published in 1953 by a man who was, at the time, a functioning addict. William Burroughs, Junkie. Not a recovery memoir, not a cautionary tale, something stranger, an honest account of what it felt like to choose the thing that was destroying him. Burroughs wrote, with a clarity that discomforts everyone who reads it, that addiction was a way of life, that it organized the day, structured the relationships, supplied a purpose that ordinary life had failed to supply, and that walking away from it required deciding that what it cost was no longer worth what it provided. He used the first person throughout. This doesn't mean Burroughs was right about everything. It doesn't mean addiction isn't, in important neurobiological ways, a condition that reshapes the brain and makes quitting genuinely harder than simply deciding to. It isn't a clean moral tale, but here is what's worth holding. A man who lived inside addiction, at its worst, in the middle of the 20th century, wrote about it with more grammatical honesty than the treatment system built in the 21st century to address it. He said, the system was built, at its foundations, on the premise that I was the wrong word. If you've been watching someone you love cycle through treatment, program after program, each one described as evidence-based, each one ending in relapse, each relapse explained as a symptom of the disease rather than a moment of decision, then what's in the description is for you specifically. The Decent Mind Reading Companion is a 90-day guide through 30 of Dalrymple's most precise City Journal essays, one per session with a page of context, the American application, and one question worth sitting with. Not a summary of his thinking, a structured way into the archive itself, the framework this video draws from, extended. The link is in the description. Now here is what the timeline doesn't explain, and what the comfortable narrative cannot explain, and what this channel exists to name directly. The treatment system did not fail because it lacked resources. It did not fail because researchers hadn't yet understood the neuroscience. It did not fail because compassionate people made honest mistakes and learned from them. A 2019 paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry documented something that had become visible by then to anyone willing to look at the financial architecture of addiction treatment in America. Medication-assisted treatment programs, methadone maintenance, buprenorphine, had become a $35 billion industry, and the primary metric by which that industry measured its own success was not sobriety, not recovery, not the patient standing on his own feet. It was retention. Engagement with services. Whether the patient kept showing up, this is not a conspiracy. No one needed to gather in a room and decide to keep people sick. The structure did what structures do. It rewarded the behavior that kept it funded, and it defined success in a way that made the funding perpetual. Dalrymple had seen the British version of this in the 1990s, in the harm reduction programs that distributed clean needles and methadone without requiring behavioral change. He watched the administrators of those programs redefine what they were trying to accomplish, not because they were evil, but because redefining the destination is the easiest way to ensure you always arrive. He described it as the therapeutic relationship becoming a growth industry. The patient's continued dysfunction was not a failure of the program. It was its operating condition. The compassion was real. The care was, in many individual cases, genuine. But the system, the financial, institutional, definitional system, had a structural interest in the permanence of the problem it claimed to treat. And the most important thing it needed to protect was not any particular drug or any particular program, it was the grammar. The idea that the patient was not the subject of the sentence. That things happened to him. That the correct response was management, maintenance, engagement. Anything except the grammatically impossible act of choosing differently. This is where Rob Henderson's observation cuts deepest. Henderson, who grew up in foster care, who watched luxury beliefs operate on people who couldn't afford the consequences, describes a particular kind of idea, one that is costless for the people who design it, and catastrophic for the people who live inside it. The disease model of addiction is a luxury belief in precisely this sense. For the psychiatrist, for the policy designer, for the researcher writing grant applications, it costs nothing to define agency out of the equation. The abstraction is tidy. The billing codes are clean. The metrics are achievable. For the man whose agency was defined out of his own recovery, it cost everything. The grammar Dalrymple tracked in a British hospital in the 1990s was not a local dialect. It was a worldview, what German gives us the precise word for, Weltanschauung. A total picture of the world, not consciously chosen, but absorbed over time from the culture a person lives inside. The worldview said, you are not the cause of your condition. You are the effect of forces outside yourself. The correct response is not decision, it is treatment, management, engagement with services. That worldview descended, as it always does, from people who would not live by it. The researcher who defined addiction as a purely neurobiological phenomenon went home every evening and made choices about what to eat, what to drink, when to stop. The policy designer who argued against sobriety requirements for treatment funding had, in their own life, a series of commitments they kept because they had decided to keep them. The ideas were designed at one altitude and detonated at another. Dalrymple's finding, the one that made him unwelcome in English editorial rooms for a decade, is not that addicts are weak or immoral. It is that the system built to help them had a structural interest in their continuing to need it. And that the most compassionate-sounding language in the room was doing the most damage, because it removed the one thing that recovery actually requires. Not willpower, in the moralistic sense, not punishment, not judgment. The first person singular, the grammatical possibility of doing something differently. The anger you've carried about the program that didn't work, the counselor who said the relapse was expected, the system that kept him engaged but never got him out. That anger was not impotence. It was not grief making you irrational. It was a correct perception that the system had defined its destination in a way that guaranteed you would never arrive at yours. The distinction matters, because impotent rage has nowhere to go. But a named mechanism, a diagnosis with a documented architecture, is something you can use in a conversation, in a decision about what kind of help to look for. In the quieter question of whether what your son needed was someone who would hold him to a standard not in cruelty, but in the belief that he was still the subject of his own sentence, Dalrymple did not believe that every person who struggled with addiction was simply making a bad choice and needed to be told to stop. He was a physician. He understood the pharmacology. He understood how pain, boredom, hopelessness, and the absence of anything worth being sober for could make the choice feel like it wasn't one. What he refused to do was use that understanding to build a system that confirmed the worst thing the culture had already told these people about themselves. That they were not the authors of their lives. The knife did not go in. Someone held it. That's not a condemnation. It's the prerequisite for anything that follows. The question that remains, and it's smaller than the one we started with, which is how questions get harder as you answer them, is this: what do you do with a diagnosis that the people running the system cannot afford to accept? Not nothing. A named mechanism is not the same as a solution. But it changes what you're looking for, who you trust, and what you ask of the people who claim to be helping. It changes the conversation you have with your son, if you still have the chance to have it. Not toward blame, but toward the grammatical possibility that he is still the person who can decide. And it changes how you understand your own instinct, the one that kept saying, even when you were told you were wrong to say it, that something structural had failed. Not just you, not just him, the system. If you've ever sat across from a counselor who told you that expecting more of someone in recovery would re-traumatize them, and something in you went quiet because you didn't have the language to push back, but you knew something was wrong with what you'd just heard, tell me what you wished you'd said.